Some of the biggest hits in music history were built on someone else's work, and the originals were almost always from the 1960s. Here are 15 ripoffs of 1960s classic songs you won't believe they got away with. Number 15, He's So Fine by the Chiffons, 1963. Ripped off by My Sweet Lord by George Harrison, 1970. Chiffons were a New York girl group who recorded He's So Fine in 1963, and it reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, spending 4 weeks at the top. The song was written by Ronnie Mack, who died of Hodgkin's disease in 1963 at the age of 22, just months after the song became a hit. It was one of the defining records of the early 1960s girl group era. George Harrison released My Sweet Lord in November 1970 as the first solo single from a Beatle to top the American charts. It reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and in the United Kingdom. The song was a spiritual declaration, built around chants of Hare Krishna that alternated with the Hallelujah refrain. It was, by any measure, one of the most significant solo releases of the post-Beatles era. Bright Tunes Music Corporation, which owned the copyright to He's So Fine, filed a lawsuit against Harrison in 1971, alleging that the melody of My Sweet Lord was substantially similar to theirs. The case went to trial and was decided by Judge Richard Owen in 1976. Owen found that Harrison had engaged in what he termed subconscious plagiarism, that he had not deliberately copied the melody, but had absorbed it so thoroughly that he reproduced it without awareness. It was the first time that concept had been formally applied in a music copyright case, and the ruling created legal precedent that has shaped music copyright law ever since. Harrison was ordered to pay damages. The total financial exposure from the case was substantial. Harrison subsequently purchased the Bright Tunes catalog himself in a complicated proceeding that became its own legal saga. The song that was his greatest solo commercial achievement became permanently attached to the question of where musical inspiration ends and copying begins. Number 14, You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin' by the Righteous Brothers, 1964. Interpolated in I Don't Want to Miss a Thing by Aerosmith, 1998. You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin' was produced by Phil Spector and written by Barry Mann, Cynthia Weil, and Phil Spector, and released in December 1964. It reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and became one of the most played records in American radio history. BMI has estimated it as the most performed song in the 20th century, having been broadcast over 14 million times. Bill Medley and Bobby Hatfield's vocal performance, backed by Spector's Wall of Sound production, was a defining document of the decade. Aerosmith's I Don't Want to Miss a Thing, released in 1998 from the Armageddon soundtrack, was written by Diane Warren and became the band's only #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. The song's chord progression and melodic structure bear a close resemblance to the Righteous Brothers recording. No formal lawsuit was filed, and the similarity was not legally adjudicated. Warren has received sole writing credit for the song. The comparison between the two recordings has been noted by music scholars and listeners since the Aerosmith track's release. Whether the resemblance is coincidental, a product of working within the same emotional and harmonic tradition, or something more deliberate, is a question that the absence of litigation left unanswered. The Righteous Brothers recording was so thoroughly embedded in American musical culture by 1998 that its influence on subsequent ballads is simply assumed rather than examined. Number 13, Johnny B. Good by Chuck Berry, 1958. Ripped off by Back in the USSR by the Beatles, 1968.
Go, Johnny, go, go, Johnny, go.
Chuck Berry recorded Johnny Be Good in 1958, and it reached number 2 on the R&B chart and number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100. The song became one of the most covered and referenced pieces of rock and roll ever recorded, and its guitar introduction is among the most recognizable in the history of popular music. Berry's influence on rock guitar playing was so fundamental that virtually every guitarist who came after him was drawing from his vocabulary to some degree. The Beatles opened the White Album in November 1968 with Back in the USSR, a song that deliberately and openly referenced Berry's Back in the USA, a 1959 recording, in its title and structure.
Flew in from Miami Beach, BUAC.
Paul McCartney has acknowledged the direct Berry influence on the song throughout his career. The question of whether Back in the USSR constitutes a ripoff or an homage depends largely on how much original material one believes was added to the source. Berry himself was famously observant about the uses to which his music was put by white artists who were more commercially successful. He has spoken in interviews about the economics of that situation, about watching artists become wealthy performing in his tradition, while his own financial situation remained complicated by the contractual and legal difficulties that characterized his career. No lawsuit was filed over Back in the USSR. The Beatles had always worn their influences openly, and Berry's influence was simply more visible than most.
Back in the USSR.
Number 12, Stand By Me by Benny King, 1961. Basis for dozens of songs, most directly Every Breath You Take by The Police, 1983.
As you stand by me.
Benny King recorded Stand By Me in 1961, reaching number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100. The song was written by King with Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, building on a gospel foundation that gave it an emotional gravity unusual in the pop music of its era. The bass line, a repeated 4-bar pattern, became one of the most recognizable and most borrowed musical figures in popular music history. Sting of the Police has acknowledged that Every Breath You Take, released in 1983, was built with awareness of the Stand By Me bass pattern. The specific figures are not identical, but the structural similarity and emotional register are close enough that the comparison has been made consistently by critics and scholars since the Police recording's release. No lawsuit was filed over the bass comparison. The broader legal history of Every Breath You Take involves a different dispute, with Puff Daddy's 1997 track, I'll Be Missing You, in which an uncleared sample of the Police song resulted in Sting receiving a substantial portion of the royalties from a recording he had nothing to do with creating. The King recording remains a foundation from which an enormous amount of popular music has drawn without acknowledgement.
Every breath you take.
Number 11, Oh Darling by the Beatles, 1969. Melodic influence on How Deep Is Your Love by the Bee Gees, 1977.
Oh, darling.
The Beatles released Oh Darling on Abbey Road in September 1969. It was a Paul McCartney composition performed in a raw, shouted style that McCartney recorded multiple times across several mornings, coming in early each day to attempt the lead vocal until he felt his voice had the right quality of strain. The song was a deliberate pastiche of 1950s rhythm and blues vocal performance. The Bee Gees' How Deep Is Your Love, released in 1977 from the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, shares melodic and harmonic characteristics with the McCartney recording that have been noted by music critics. The Bee Gees, Barry, Robin, and Morris Gibb, were among the most prolific and commercially successful songwriters of the 1970s.
Your eyes in the morning sun.
And their absorption of earlier pop and rock vocabulary was total and acknowledged. No lawsuit was filed over the comparison, and the similarity is one of general melodic approach and emotional register rather than specific note-for-note correspondence. The Saturday Night Fever soundtrack went on to become one of the best-selling albums in history, selling over 15 million copies in the United States alone. How Deep Is Your Love reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. The Beatles' recordings that informed it continued to generate their own substantial royalties, which somewhat softened the question of credit.
How deep is your love? Is your love?
Number 10, Whole Lotta Love by Led Zeppelin, 1969, ripped off from You Need Love by Muddy Waters, 1962.
I know you need love. You just gotta have some love.
Muddy Waters recorded You Need Love in 1962, with the song credited to Willie Dixon. The recording drew on the same Chicago blues tradition that Waters had been developing since his move from Mississippi in 1943, and it became part of a catalog that British musicians of the 1960s treated extensively as source material. Led Zeppelin released Whole Lotta Love in November 1969, reaching number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100. The song's primary riff, verse structure, and lyrical content were drawn substantially from the Waters and Dixon recording. Dixon filed a lawsuit against Led Zeppelin and reached a settlement in 1985 that included financial payment and the addition of his name to the writing credits. The Dixon estate reached a further settlement in 1987. Dixon's willingness to pursue the case represented an unusual outcome in a landscape where black blues musicians had been watching white artists profit from their work for decades without recourse. The settlement did not undo the financial disparity between what Led Zeppelin earned through the 1970s and what Dixon received in that period. The song has generated tens of millions of dollars since 1969. Dixon's estate now shares in future income from the settlement date forward. Number 9, Respect by Otis Redding, 1965, rearranged by Aretha Franklin, 1967. Otis Redding recorded Respect in 1965 and released it as a single that reached number 4 on the R&B chart. The song was an assertive declaration from a man to his partner. He provided for the household and expected respect in return. Redding performed it with the confident authority that characterized everything he recorded, and the original was a genuine R&B hit. Aretha Franklin recorded her version in February 1967, transforming the song's meaning entirely. Franklin took Redding's demand for domestic respect and turned it into a declaration of autonomy and dignity.
Hey, little girl, you're so sweet, little honey.
The feminist and civil rights implications of the rearranged version were immediately understood by the audience that made it number 1 on both the pop and R&B charts. Redding heard Franklin's version and reportedly acknowledged that she had taken his song from him, that the definitive recording was now hers. He was right. Franklin's version became a cultural landmark, while the original is primarily known to people who specifically followed the recording's history. The publishing income went to Redding, and after his death in December 1967, to his estate. Franklin's specific arrangement choices were never separately credited. They belonged to performance rather than composition under the copyright framework of the time.
Just give it respect when I come home.
Number 8, The House of the Rising Sun arrangement by The Animals, 1964, ripped off from earlier folk recordings.
A house in New Orleans.
The House of the Rising Sun is a traditional folk song whose origins are unclear. Versions existed in American folk music at least as far back as the 1930s, recorded by Clarence Tom Ashley and Gwen Foster in 1933 and by Lead Belly. Dave Van Ronk, The Greenwich Village folk musician developed the specific guitar arrangement that Bob Dylan used on his 1962 debut album, crediting it to traditional. Dylan recorded it before asking Van Ronk's permission, a fact Van Ronk noted with displeasure in interviews. The Animals heard Dylan's version and recorded their own in May 1964 in a single studio take. Their version, released in June 1964, reached #1 in both the United Kingdom and the United States and became one of the most recognized recordings of the British invasion. The arrangement was substantially derived from Van Ronk's interpretation. Van Ronk received no credit and no royalties. The song being a traditional work in the public domain meant the composition was not protectable, and the question of whether a specific arrangement could be separately copyrighted was not pursued. Van Ronk spent the following decades as a respected figure in folk music, without the financial recognition that the Animals hit might have made possible. He died in February 2002. Number 7, Hound Dog by Big Mama Thornton, 1952, ripped off by Elvis Presley, 1956, but specifically the 1960s commercial dominance of Elvis's version over the original. The Hound Dog was recorded by Big Mama Thornton in August 1952 and released in February 1953, where it spent 7 weeks at #1 on the R&B chart. The song was written by Jerry Leiber and Mike Stoller, who were white teenagers from Los Angeles, writing specifically for black R&B artists. Thornton recorded it with ferocity and humor that made it an immediate hit in the R&B market. Elvis Presley recorded his version in July 1956, after seeing Freddie Bell and the Bell Boys perform a comedic interpretation of the song in Las Vegas. Presley's version reached #1 on the pop, country, and R&B charts simultaneously and sold several million copies. I ain't gonna feed you no more. It is one of the best-selling singles in American recording history. Thornton received a flat fee for her recording, the standard arrangement for black artists on independent labels in the early 1950s, and no royalty participation in the song's subsequent commercial life. The songwriting royalties went to Leiber and Stoller, who had written the composition. When Presley's version became a phenomenon, Thornton received nothing from that commercial success. She continued to perform and record for the rest of her life, acknowledged as an important figure in the history of blues and rock and roll, while the financial rewards of her most famous recording belonged to everyone involved except her. Number 6, Light My Fire by The Doors, 1967, ripped off by Jose Feliciano, 1968, and further by various commercial uses. Come on, baby, light my fire. The Doors released Light My Fire as a single in June 1967, edited from its full album length of nearly 7 minutes to around 3 minutes for radio play. The edited version reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and became the band's signature song for a generation of listeners. The song was written primarily by guitarist Robbie Krieger and built around a distinctive keyboard figure played by Ray Manzarek. Jose Feliciano released a slow, acoustic guitar-based interpretation in 1968 that reached #3 on the Billboard Hot 100. The cover was controversial, not because of plagiarism, but because Feliciano's performance of the national anthem at the 1968 World Series, in a similarly personal style, caused a national controversy about artistic reinterpretation of patriotic material. Come on, baby, light my fire. The Doors were paid publishing royalties from Feliciano's version, as is standard for cover recordings. The more significant rip-off controversy involved a 1967 approach from a Buick automobile representative to Jim Morrison, asking to license Light My Fire for a television commercial. Morrison refused. Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore were reportedly inclined to accept the substantial licensing fee. Morrison threatened to smash a Buick on stage if the commercial aired. The commercial was not made. The band's legal agreement required unanimous consent for commercial licensing, and Morrison exercised his veto. Krieger has spoken about the financial consequence of that decision in interviews. The fee offered was significant, and the precedent it would have set for the band's catalog was substantial. Number 5, Twist and Shout by the Isley Brothers, 1962, ripped off by the Beatles, 1963. Twist and Shout was written by Phil Medley and Bert Burns, and first recorded by the Top Notes in 1961 in a version that failed commercially. The Isley Brothers recorded it in 1962 with an arrangement that was more energetic and better suited to the material, and their version reached number 17 on the Billboard Hot 100 and was a genuine R&B hit. The Beatles recorded their version in February 1963 at the end of a marathon recording session for their debut album, Please Please Me, when John Lennon's voice was severely strained. The result was a performance of extraordinary raw energy that became one of the most famous recordings in their catalog. The Isley Brothers version is largely forgotten except by people who specifically followed the recording's history. Publishing royalties from the Beatles version went to the songwriters, Medley and Burns, as is standard for cover recordings. The Isley Brothers, who had made the song a hit in its recognizable form before the Beatles recorded it, received nothing from the enormous commercial life of the Beatles version. Their arrangement, their energy, and the version that the Beatles had clearly heard and were drawing from in terms of tempo and approach, none of that was compensable under the copyright framework of the time. Ronald Isley has acknowledged the situation in interviews without significant bitterness, noting that it was simply how the industry operated. Number 4, Oh Pretty Woman by Roy Orbison, 1964, sampled in Oh Pretty Woman by Van Halen, 1982, and central to a landmark Supreme Court case. Pretty woman walking down the street. Roy Orbison and Bill Dees wrote Oh Pretty Woman, and Orbison recorded it in 1964. It reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and became one of the most recognized recordings of the decade. The song's opening guitar riff, 2 bars of unmistakable melody, is among the most commercially valuable pieces of recorded music from the 1960s. 2 Live Crew, the Miami rap group, recorded a parody version of the song in 1989 that used the opening riff and rewrote the lyrics with content that was explicitly sexual and broadly comic. Acuff Rose Music, which owned the publishing rights to the Orbison original, sued 2 Live Crew for copyright infringement. The case, Campbell versus Acuff Rose Music, Incorporated, went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. In 1994, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in favor of 2 Live Crew, holding that commercial parody can constitute fair use under copyright law, even when it uses substantial portions of the original copyrighted work. The ruling established the most important legal precedent for parody in American copyright law and has been cited in copyright cases ever since. Orbison had died in December 1988 and did not live to see the Supreme Court decision that his song had prompted. Van Halen had released a straight cover of the song in 1982 that required standard licensing rather than litigation. Couldn't help but see Pretty Woman. Number 3, La Bamba by Richie Valens, 1958, used as the template for Louie Louie by the Kingsmen, 1963, chord structure. Richie Valens recorded La Bamba in 1958, adapting a traditional Mexican folk song with a three-chord rock and roll arrangement. The song's chord progression, simple, driving, and adaptable, became one of the most used templates in early rock and roll. Valens died on February 3, 1959, in the same plane crash that killed Buddy Holly and the Big Bopper. He was 17 years old. Richard Berry wrote Louie, Louie in 1955 and recorded it in 1956 using a chord progression that mirrors the La Bamba structure with minimal variation. The Kingsmen's 1963 recording of Louie, Louie, which used the same chord structure, became one of the most covered and recognized songs in rock history and was the subject of the FBI investigation described elsewhere. Berry sold the rights to Louie, Louie in 1959 for a reported $750, a transaction he spent decades attempting to reverse. The chord progression itself, being a sequence of common chords rather than a specific melody, was not legally protected, and the entire family of songs built on it are connected by a structural similarity rather than a copying of specific protected expression. Berry eventually recovered some of his rights through legal action in the 1980s and received recognition for his contribution to rock music, including a Pioneer Award from the Rhythm and Blues Foundation in 1988. Valens, who died before any of this unfolded, received no benefit from the template his recording helped popularize. Number 2, Got My Mojo Working by Muddy Waters, 1957, ripped off by dozens, most explicitly by Messin' with the Kid by Junior Wells, 1960.
Got my mojo working, buddy.
Muddy Waters recorded Got My Mojo Working in 1957, though the song was written by Preston Foster and had been recorded by Ann Cole earlier that same year. Waters began performing it before Cole's version was released, apparently unaware of the existing recording, and his version became the definitive one, particularly his performance at the Newport Jazz Festival in 1960, captured on Muddy Waters at Newport. The broader pattern here is Chicago blues recordings from the late 1950s and early 1960s, functioning as direct source material for the British invasion bands, whose recordings generated enormous commercial income without flowing back to the originators. The Rolling Stones, the Animals, Cream, and Led Zeppelin all drew specifically from the Chicago blues catalog. Some borrowings were acknowledged, many were not. Lawsuits were rarely filed. The legal infrastructure was expensive, artists were often constrained by their contracts, and the power differential between a major label and an independent blues artist was enormous. Waters received Grammy Awards in the 1970s, acknowledging his foundational status, and toured with the Rolling Stones in 1981 in a pairing that visibly recognized the debt. He died in April 1983. The financial reckoning for the blues artists whose work built the commercial empire of 1960s rock has never fully occurred. Number 1, Good Vibrations by the Beach Boys, 1966, influenced by Phil Spector's Wall of Sound, specifically Be My Baby by the Ronettes, 1963. The Ronettes recorded Be My Baby in 1963, with Phil Spector producing using his Wall of Sound technique, a dense, layered approach to studio recording that stacked multiple instruments, created reverb, and built a sonic architecture of unusual depth. Spector wrote the song with Jeff Barry and Ellie Greenwich, and it reached number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. The drum introduction, one of the most recognizable sounds in the history of recorded music, was played by Hal Blaine of the Wrecking Crew session musicians. Brian Wilson has said that hearing Be My Baby for the first time was one of the most significant musical experiences of his life, that the production, the sound, the sense of emotional enormity it conveyed changed what he understood about what a record could be. He pulled his car over to listen to it completely when it came on the radio. He spent the following years attempting to absorb and then exceed what Spector had achieved. Good Vibrations, released in October 1966, was the result.
I'm picking up good vibrations.
It cost approximately $50,000 to record, an extraordinary sum for a single in 1966, and reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. The Spector influence is visible in the production approach, the use of the theremin, and the sense of sonic layering. But Wilson's arrangement and compositional ambition had developed beyond imitation into something original. No lawsuit was filed, and Wilson has spoken about Spector's influence with consistent gratitude and acknowledgement. The Ronettes, including lead singer Ronnie Spector, who was married to Phil Spector and whose relationship with him was controlling and abusive, received little financial benefit from the enormous commercial life of the recordings they had made. Ronnie Spector spent decades in legal disputes over royalties. She died in January 2022. The record that helped inspire Good Vibrations continued to generate income long after the people who made it had moved on from any world where those earnings were accessible to them. The 1960s gave popular music everything: its vocabulary, its emotional range, its production ambitions. The people who came after took those gifts and went to #1 with them. The people who gave them rarely got a receipt. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe so you never miss what we put out next.